now.
All right, welcome to the next episode of the Disciple Standard Podcast, episode 2. My name is Aaron. I'm a pastor here at Sunlight Community Church, and we have our senior pastor, Pastor Scott Vanderplug. Thanks for being here again today. I want to start us off with a couple statistics or facts. We had just talked about church renewal. I mean, that's an ongoing conversation in the CRC. Our denomination is the Christian Reformed Church of North America. And I've got some stats here, and I'll build to maybe a question or a couple questions. I'm not too sure. In 1996, this is from the CRC yearbooks, there was 291,000 members. 10 years later, in 2006, there's 272,000 members. 10 years later, in 2016, there's 235,000 members. In 2021, there's 211,000 members. So we see a decline, a steep decline, actually getting steeper in the CRC. Now that's just not CRC. I've noticed that the number one search, or one of the number one search terms on YouTube was, is the Christian church dying in North America? This is from Statista. People who identify as Protestant in 1948 is 69%. But in 2023, it's 33%. So we see a steep decline there. I could keep going. In Gallup, church attendance has declined 12% over 20 years, and this is all churches, so this is not just CRC. So I'm going through CRC, Protestant, and now all Christian churches. 2 decades ago, an average of 42% of U.S. adults attended religious services a week, or every week, or nearly every week. A decade ago, that figure fell to 38%, so 4 or 5% dip, 6. And it's currently at 30%. This decline is largely driven by an increase in percentage of Americans with no religious affiliation, 9% to 21%. That was the increase in no religious affiliation. Nearly all faiths declines in regular attendance year over year. This is all by Gallup. There's statistics here. Barna Group, Pew Research Group, 39% of millennials report attending church regularly. And that's just a little bit up from 21%. And 40% of millennials are religiously unaffiliated. 40% of millennials are religiously unaffiliated. Pew Research Center. Look, I could keep going about the decline in Christianity. I think there's a decline in churches. I want to know what your thoughts are on this decline, and if I could even be so bold to ask, like, what is something churches can do? Like, if I could say, what is, like, the number one thing that's easily implementable from churches, from pastors? Like, what is, like, I guess I'm asking a big question here. What is happening? What are your thoughts on it? And what can we do about it?
Okay, that's a lot.
Yeah.
It's like drinking the fire hose.
Yep.
To think about all that. Yeah, you just threw out a ton of statistics. I'll try to sum it up a little bit first, which is, I think, right in the mid-90s, early 2000s, if we look back, we'll see that there's a shift that happened then. So you used our own denomination statistics. I think the first year you talked about was 1996, and you said there was 291.
Yeah, 291.
I think if you go back just a couple of years before that, we crested out like at 310 or maybe 320, somewhere in that area. That was the height of the Christian Reformed Church. Okay. And that was been in the early 90s. Now, you wouldn't maybe know this, but I remember it because in the early 90s, I was like sophomore, junior in high school, and actually our denomination had been growing all the way up until that time, and maybe we were getting close to 325 now if I think about it.
Okay.
Because our denomination had this initiative, and the initiative is that we were going to hit 400,000 people by the year 2000.
Oh, wow.
And every church in our denomination, I think, bought into that initiative, because even in Vancouver, Washington, in the small little church I was a part of, I remember them putting up a banner that said 400,000 by the year 2000.
We're sure
So this could have been
happen.
in like 1991, 1992. Oof. And it just things were on the rise. So it seemed like through church planting, through evangelism, through everything that had been working up until that time, it seemed like a reasonable goal. And it's interesting because just a few years later, the decline started. And I would think kind of mid-90s. There was some church politics that probably got involved that started that decline. But now if you look at it from the big picture, you just realize actually North American Christianity as a whole, something kind of happened. I often follow this little Gallup poll. And since the 1940s, they've been asking people, do you happen to belong to a church, synagogue, or mosque? And they track that every 5-6 years or so. And if you just follow the line graph that they have of this, because they've been consistently asking this, and of course in North America, if you happen to belong to a church, synagogue, or mosque, the majority is Christian. I mean, of course there's some Muslims, of course there's some Jews, but the majority. So, yeah, I don't remember all the numbers exactly, but they're all right around 70% of people answered yes. And, sometimes it went up. I think the highest mark was 76%. Sometimes it went down. It was like 68, 69% in 1 year, kind of in there. But at the year 2000, then it started breaking down for the first time. I think in the year 2000, it was right at 70% or 71% answered yes to that question. So that's only 25 years ago.
Yeah.
Church attendance was like it was back in the 40s. It was pretty consistent. 70% of people happened to belong to a church, synagogue, or mosque, which didn't mean they attended every week, but they were members there.
They felt like they were
members. They belonged there.
Mm-hmm.
They knew that was my place. As you get into the 2000s, it breaks down into the 60s, and then it breaks down into the 50s after 2010. And in 2021, when Gallup last did this poll, it came out at 48%. So we broke down into the 40s, from the 70s to the 60s, from the 60s to the 50s, and in 2021, we hit 48%. Now, we had COVID since then. I think a lot of things have happened. It's probably going to be one more year we're going to get another readout.
Yeah.
And, has the number gone up or down? I'm almost certain it's gone further down.
30s?
We don't know yet. But I'm anticipating we're going to be in the low 40s or the upper 30s, which means in 20 years we've just sort of like cut in half the number of Christians. And, in like 25 years, you've got almost 80 million people now. If you just buy, there's like 330 million people in the United States. If you do like 70% down to 47%, you're going to find out it's almost 80 million people who 25 years ago, all those 80 million people would have said, yes, I do happen to belong to a church, synagogue, or mosque. And now there's 80 million people who respond and say no.
Right.
Of course, not the exact same people. I mean, we have a generational shift.
Right.
But I think that's what all your statistics are getting at.
Yeah.
So if I was to have like a mental image of this, it's almost like we're trying to swim to some place, but the tide is going out against us. Huh. So here's all these churches, and I think every church wants to grow. It wants to have a vital mission. It would like to advance, not retreat. But we're swimming as hard as we possibly can, but the entire tide is like pulling us further and further away. And I think so I'm just thinking about the entire time I've been in ministry, from like the year 2000 onward. I mean, I would have said maybe in like, it was 1998 when I first went off to seminary. So it's basically been my adult life and the time I've been in ministry that there was this huge shift. And what's interesting about it, at least in my viewpoint, is it may be subtle at first, like, oh, we're swimming, but some of us are still making ground, but now almost nobody is making any ground. It's like the the current of that tide is accelerating
Yeah.
and pulling us all further away. I mean, that's just what's happening in North America. So almost no matter how great your church is or how good things are going, there's a larger landscape.
Yeah.
So there are still churches that are making progress, obviously. But in the larger landscape of things, everyone is being pulled like further out. At least it's not like that across the world, by the way. I mean,
No.
in Asia, in Africa, even in the Middle East. I think maybe even now in Europe, finally, they're starting to make some progress.
Europe.
I mean, the tide really went out in Europe.
Yeah.
And now we seem to be following in that, we're experiencing that same tide in the United States or North America. But there's other places where the church is surging forward in like the most incredible ways.
Yeah, I think, but before I get to like, what do you think we could do about it, or what have you done about it? Why do you think that is? Like, is it urban sprawl, digitalization? Is it politics? Is it, what do you think? Just really quick. I know we're no experts here, but what are you thinking?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of people studying this question, and there's probably a lot of potential answers. There's external factors, like a shift in our culture, and then there's internal factors. It's probably worth talking about both of those a little bit. So external factors, what's happened in that same time frame? Well, I really can remember, I think the year was 1995 when I really saw the internet for the first time. I was mildly aware of the fact that you could get online. You had this old dial-up thing, and I can even remember when I was in high school, we had this handy computer, and we could connect and download a little something, But I remember that someone showed me Yahoo. It was like, you could type in something, and it'd take you to a website. And that was probably in the year 1995, 1996. So... did culture change? Man, culture changed. I remember when I was in high school, I was a senior in high school, I saw a cell phone for the first time. It was like this big. It was like a brick with a huge antenna on it.
Something you'd see in like a battlefield, like.
So the amount of change in our culture, like externally, it's crazy, the breakneck speed. I remember, like if I talk to my dad, he remembers like getting a television for the first time in their house. And I would say like, oh yeah, to go from a house that has no television, you receive all your outside information through like a newspaper or whatever, and all of a sudden you can watch the evening news inside your house. Like that would just the television changed culture so much.
Right.
You can watch sporting games. There's television shows. You start having the rise of the influence of, media into your home. I think, the change from no television to television, what a cultural change. But that's nothing compared to, the start of the internet,
Right.
mobile phones, social media, now AI. The amount of change that's happening every single year is crazy.
Yeah, with just AI.
And how would we... So, to a certain extent, like, all this cultural change happened externally, and how the church keep up. I mean, the church had kind of been doing its thing, and then all of a sudden, like, you can now watch someone else preach on your television, and that person preaches better than my local preacher preaches.
Right.
That is a tremendous, change in Christianity. That wasn't possible before. But now, it's not just like, there's a few preachers on television I can tune into. I can literally go online, and pretty much every church has some kind of live stream or some kind of video of what it's doing. So, how do we keep up with all this external change, the cultural changes that have occurred? I would say, like, people are tracking generations. What's the different generation between, like, the greatest generation and the baby boomers? I'm part of Generation X. What's the difference between the baby boomers and Generation X? Then you get the millennials that come in. What's the difference between Generation X and the millennials? And now, you get to Z and the Alpha.
Yeah.
I mean, it's because each of these generations technologically is so different.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. We were just talking about this. We had a little breakfast here at church this morning, and it was actually our worship pastor was bringing up that maybe at the school one of the kids has got AirPod in, and they're asking Siri to help them as they're taking a test. And now I just imagine you can use AI to pretty much answer any question.
Right.
It's only going to get better and better and better.
Yep.
This AI it's incredible.
Yep.
The breakneck speed in which things are changing. And anyway, I think you got all that external change. The church had a tough time keeping up with it.
Got it.
Then you've got what's wrong internally. So we talked about this last week already a little too. Churches had traditionally been more of like a parish model, where the church was just part of your neighborhood. It was most likely that you were going to walk to church, or it's a short drive. And then there began to be kind of regionalized churches that it's not your grandfather's church. They've got a kind of excellence in their programming. And so, that forced all churches to start making a transition from, what it had been. And there were problems. Many of these places were just like social clubs. What it had been to something else. And pastors really had to start learning how to, like, run excellent programs. And so the role of the pastor even shifted toward, I'll call it this sort of like mega church model, or legacy system of how the church operates right now. And as it turns out, my critique is that the church became too centralized. The work of the Great Commission got left in the hands of only a few. Congregations itself became more like audiences or passive observers than they were like the people of God who are coming to be equipped for ministry. And that just resulted as of this shift. And then you have all these cultural shifts that demand that the average Christian person knows how to share the gospel and can disciple other people, and churches just weren't ready for that. In fact, the average Christian is knowing less and less of the Bible. They're spending less and less time in prayer. They are spending less and less time in ministry. In fact, what wound up happening is that people became volunteers for programs, because churches are running all these programs. They need all kinds of volunteers to run these programs. Yeah. And so the church just sort of got weaker.
Do you mean like the church that centralized, that less people get to know how to preach? It's just one preacher, or evangelize. Like, hey, let me tell my neighbor about the gospel by bringing him to church and having my pastor tell.
All that was happening.
Okay.
All that was happening. I just think... the average Christian is less knowledgeable about what it means to be a Christian. They feel less equipped to train and equip other people. It's amazing, because you can have a 10,000 member church. There's only like one or two people who are capable of preaching out of 10,000 people.
Right.
And the people who come to that church are like the audience.
Yeah.
And the pastor's on a stage, and the music became more entertaining. The pastor needs to be more entertaining. I got to do at least as well as the people you can go watch on TV. And so the expectations were kind of raised about what was going to happen in a worship service on Sunday morning. So, we had this conference here at church this week. There was a group of pastors who came, all Korean American pastors, and they talked about the sheer energy it takes to prepare for an hour on Sunday morning worship.
Yeah.
Not only what they have to do personally to prepare a sermon, but just the organization it takes to have all the volunteers and the music. And I mean, a ton of resources being put toward 1 hour out of 168. Anyway, the point is, not only were there all these external challenges, but then there became these internal challenges, and the rate of change externally and how things are operating internally makes it very difficult to get, I mean, okay, what's happening right now, it's not sufficient. We're not swimming faster than the current's pulling us out.
Right.
So, yeah, the church in North America seems to be receding or dropping back. And, okay, I think you were ending with the question of like, oh, what's a couple quick things we can do to turn it around?
Yeah. So
and I guess I'm getting to the answer of like, oh, I don't think there's just like, here's 2 quick little tips, and next thing you know, we'll reverse all these numbers. I don't think there's an answer like that.
If I'm a pastor of a church who has seen the decline, or let's talk specifically for the CRC, if I'm part of this church where there's no growth as far as numbers or even probably leadership, I would say you would pair that with spirituality. Or if I'm a church outside, like, kind of just dwindling numbers or stagnation, I would be kind of desperate. Like, hey, how do I grow the church? How do I grow the kingdom? What's my purpose here? Like, what are we doing here? Am I just going to wait for all my congregation to die out?
Well, there's a lot of people in that place right now.
Yeah.
I mean, the number of churches that are closing every single year, pastors who are becoming disenchanted, they feel worn out. It's interesting because actually there was this great article that I read. Maybe it's been 3, 4, 5 years ago now, but it kind of talked about how okay, suppose you're a football team. And year by year, you're just not getting anywhere. Finally, there has to be some accountability. So what do? You fire the head coach. You change out the office management. I mean, you got to make a change. So churches are sensing like, oh, we're not doing very well. So actually, the people who have taken the brunt of that is pastors.
Wow.
So think about this. I mean, oh, man, we seem to be losing. Well, what do we got to do?
Fire the head coach.
We fire the head coach. The pastor gets the brunt of that. And so actually in our denomination, it's interesting because I've seen this. I don't have the statistics right off the top of my head. But anyone who is interested, if they want, it's available, and you could find it online. Just look at Article 17s in the Christian Reformed Church. These are where a pastor gets separated from their church. Usually, I mean, sometimes it's for good reason. Oh, I'm going to go study or whatever. But often it's because, the team's been losing and the head coach needs to be fired.
They might have even covered it with like, oh, he's got to go study
or whatever, right?
Yeah.
But if you look in like the 1980s, this happened very rarely. Then in the 1990s, it started like going up. But in the last 2 decades, the 2000s and the 2010s, through the roof.
Wow.
Our small little denomination, I wish I could just remember the stats, but it's like a lot of people every year are getting burned out of ministry. And I think this is one of the problems is like, not only do you have all these churches closing, the church is in decline, now it's a leadership crisis. First of all, there's all kinds of pastors who are just feeling burned, worn out. Why am I doing this? I got to get out of here. This is the worst. I thought my life was going to be something different. I didn't realize I was going to get stuck in this tide that's just pulling me out to sea where I'm going to drown.
Right.
So
always getting critiqued, always getting questioned.
Right, because also in this megachurch model, the pastor became so much more important as the centralized figure. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, just a lot on that person's shoulders.
Everyone's looking for unicorns.
Sure.
And these unicorns
somebody
are
who
a lot of stress, a lot of
knows
pressure.
what to do, can fix all the problems.
Sure.
Yeah, so, boy, now just think about all the number of pastors. They weren't trained in a technological age.
Oh, that makes me sad.
And
makes me sad for the pastors.
not trained in a technological age. And my church has to have a website. I don't know the first thing about the internet.
Yeah.
And now I'm supposed to be on social media and be creating all this content. And I mean, the breakneck speed of change. So there's plenty of leaders who just feel sort of like, I've had enough.
And they went to seminary for like studying the Bible or counseling or preaching or something, right?
They had in mind something, and it didn't turn like what they had in mind that they were being trained to do, and what the church started requiring of them were two different things.
Run programs.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, develop these volunteers to leaders. But they're spending their time like in Hebrew and trying to learn, some basics of preaching, like this is.
Yeah. I mean, so there's that. There's that. Then now just think of like, okay, as the church has been in decline, there's a lot of young people who are sitting in these churches. They see like, oh, everyone's getting older. This isn't very vital. There's nothing going on here that interests me. These are like brilliant people who might have made fantastic leaders for the church, and maybe they even feel a little tug into ministry at one point, but they look on and they see the life of a pastor, their pastor, and they're like, I don't want to do this. I'll try to serve God some other way. And so actually, like the church, it starts off the church is in decline, but then we start to have a decline in leaders. There's fewer leaders are getting burnt out. There's fewer leaders all the time. And, I'll tell you, seminaries are really feeling this. There's fewer and fewer people going into ministry all the time. And so...
no one's encouraging them.
And the quality of people. I mean, I'm not saying anything against any current... Like, if you're a seminary student right now and you're listening in, I'm not saying anything about you in particular, but just in general, the kind of quality of student that seminaries are getting... is down. I think almost every seminary has adjusted its curriculum downward. What I mean is there was a kind of a level of achievement that you would get when you get a Master's of Divinity or some other master's degree. And, the requirements have been brought much lower.
Wow.
I mean, I give some examples.
Yeah.
When I went to seminary, it was required that by the time you got there, you had to have at least 2 years of college Greek before you could start.
What?
So when I first went to my seminary in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is Calvin Seminary, I wasn't fully admitted because I had only had 1 year of Greek, and they made me go take more Greek classes before I could be fully admitted into the seminary.
Did you have to take Greek in the seminary too?
Whoa. It was assumed that you knew Greek well enough to follow along in all the classes if you're taking a class in New Testament, it was assumed that you knew the Greek so that you could read the New Testament.
Yeah, that's a...
Okay, so now because you went to the exact same seminary, there was a requirement that you learned Greek while you were there.
Yep.
And I think probably in your case, you got the equivalent, or maybe even a little less, of 1 year of college Greek.
You're probably right. I don't know much about Greek anymore. I just it's just enough to kind of skate through.
Okay, and now with regard to Hebrew, I had to become fully capable of reading Hebrew as well. And before you started, there was something called a boot camp when you came, and it was an intensive, like 6 hours a day of learning Hebrew so that you could get a running start getting all the way through the Hebrew grammar by the time you would get to your very first quarter in seminary. Now, most seminaries don't even have a language requirement.
6 hours a day sounds even offensive to me. It's like...
Well, this is just how it was. I'm just telling you. Like,
I can't... Do you expect me to do 6 hours?
That's an example.
Yeah.
And what I'm saying is the requirement has been adjusted down. There's fewer people going into seminary. The requirement's been adjusted down because where are you going to find all these people who already have 2 years of college Greek and, no. And I'm not even saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying this is what's happened over the last 25 years.
Okay.
I think at Calvin Seminary now, you can not take any of the languages, just take a Bible tools course, which is they'll show you some language tools to help you, be able to access insights about the original languages, even though you yourself won't know the original languages, be able to read them at all.
Okay.
And yeah, it's great that we have these digital tools, but I'm just merely illustrating that, like,
The requirements.
okay, here, the bigger point is this. Churches are having a tough time. They're closing. The tide is going out. We're burning a lot of leaders who are leaving ministry. We're not taking in as many leaders as are needed. Mm-hmm. So there was actually a study done this last year in our denomination by our candidacy office. Now, the candidacy office are the ones who are helping work with students who are preparing to become pastors. And anyway, they had just noticed that, there's so many churches in our denomination without pastors. There's more pastors retiring every year than we are bringing in. So the problem's getting worse and worse and worse.
Oh boy.
And there are a lot of churches who they really need a pastor because they're facing tough times, but probably they're not going to get one because there are just not enough pastors to go around.
Wow.
So, yeah, and that's probably going to hasten their decline. I mean, a church that doesn't have a pastor who's preparing to preach and helping lead the church, I mean, that church is facing a lot of struggles probably. So that's all part of the kind of tide going out. And then my final thought about all this is that the net result of those two factors, that the church is in decline, that we're getting fewer leaders, is that we're much less effective with the Great Commission. We're making fewer disciples. There's fewer people coming to faith. And as soon as that starts happening, then it's like a vicious cycle because
less disciples,
less people,
Yep.
less churches.
Yep.
So churches are getting smaller. They're getting weaker.
Wow.
Even the average size of churches in our denomination has shrunk tremendously in 25 years.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So I'm not going to have the numbers right. I mean, somebody who's watching this is going to be able to tell us the exact numbers. But I think at some point, the average size of a Christian Reformed church was like 300 and something members. The average church.
Yeah.
I mean, there was bigger ones, there were smaller ones. Now I think it's like low 100s.
Okay.
Maybe it's not even 100. I'm not even sure.
Yeah.
Somebody who's watching this will tell us. But the point is, churches are smaller, which means they're more vulnerable, and which means their pastors probably are more stressed out, which means, all kinds of
I'm sure
things.
budgets shrink because of that
Budgets
too.
have shrunk. And so our capacity to carry out the mission of the church is also diminished.
Okay. So you've explained this vicious cycle here, right? Churches aren't taking in top talent, leaders, talented, brilliant people to want to encourage them into ministry. Without those leaders, there's less disciples, less people starting into ministry or even being part of a church, and less people to, plant these churches.
So the churches are in decline.
Yeah.
So there are fewer leaders. So there are less disciples. So the churches decline more. So there are fewer leaders, less disciples.
And down we go, huh?
So that's all part of this tide, I think, that I would describe. We're kind of being swept out to sea. And, man, it's not like people aren't trying. People are swimming as hard as they can. In many cases, swimming harder than ever before.
So let me get back to the top question here. Like, what's the magic bullet? Give me something like I need to wrap my head around, and if someone else is watching out there, but I want to know, like, okay, like what are some things that you're doing? I mean, I'm not going to assume that you're like an expert for all churches in every context, but what have you done to kind of lead us through or implemented? If you were to give like a list of priorities, what would be like the number one thing that's easiest to implement? I'm curious your thoughts on the solution, and maybe we could even talk about other solutions that other churches have tried to come up with, whether they were effective or not. I don't know.
Yeah, so you just use the term magic bullet.
Yeah.
And I think I'm trying to describe that, at least as far as I can tell, that's not there. There are churches that are using all kinds of, I'll just call them gimmicks, or, they're trying things that are finding some success, but it's not broad-based. It's not affecting the whole landscape of things, which doesn't mean we should just give up. Right. Sometimes when you're getting swept out to sea, you start swimming, you just get exhausted. Okay, I'm done, and you
hang it up.
That's it. I'm not suggesting that.
Die. You drown.
But I am suggesting that we shouldn't just think to ourselves, oh, there's like one or two like simple steps and we'll be out of this.
Okay.
I don't think it's like that. I think even setting up that way would probably lead to the wrong set of expectations. I think what we have to be prepared for is a sustained effort in the right direction.
Okay.
And now this would be my way of describing that sustained effort, which is I think there's a virtuous cycle, and we've got to start resisting, this vicious cycle by kind of steering in the other direction. So if there's a cycle and it's going this way, then we need to start kind of going this way.
We gotta.
And I would say that the first step is disciple making and disciple multiplication. Okay? Which means that as a pastor, I'm not going to be so worried about the crowd. I'm not going to be so worried about the programs. Look, I have a ministry to the crowd. I have to lead these programs, but I'm going to say to myself, wait a second. The most important thing I've got to do is I've got to make disciples, but not just make disciples who can join me in making more disciples.
Can you just describe the difference there?
Between what?
Between make disciples and make disciples that make disciples.
Oh, okay. If I just spend my effort and I'm teaching, the word for disciple in the Bible means something like learner. People who were disciples of Jesus were learning from Jesus. Actually, the Greek word, that's what it means, learner, to learn. And I could spend time teaching people and they could spend time learning. Okay, and they nod their head and they learn, and there it is. It's interesting because the Great Commission says, therefore, go and make disciples, learning. A disciple's a learner. Make disciples of all nations, baptizing in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And then it says, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded. Here's the key thing. A learner has to become a teacher. So I've got this little phrase, we use it around here, disciples make disciples. Are you a disciple of Jesus? Jesus called his disciples, said, come follow me. They spent time learning from him. They lived with him. They ate with him. They followed him. He taught them. They got special access. These disciples got special access. He'd be out teaching to the crowds, and he'd pull them aside. Hey, you guys understand what I was saying? And they'd have to say no. Then he'd explain it more and help them understand. Anyway, eventually he gathered those 11 disciples. And it's not like we stopped being learners. We're always going to be disciples of Jesus. We're always going to be learning of Jesus. But he gathered those disciples. He says, okay, now you guys go make disciples.
So are you saying that...
Teach them.
Are you saying that a disciple is only a disciple until they teach?
No, I think people can become learners of Jesus before they start teaching.
Okay.
It's required that you start learning of Jesus before you start. What are you going to teach of Jesus if you don't even know the first thing? What I'm saying is that in Christianity, the goal of being a disciple of Jesus is that you're going to become a disciple maker. And so what I'm saying is, as I go to make disciples, and I think the church has to be concerned with disciple multiplication, that I'm not just teaching people about Jesus. Okay, I can do that. I can teach people about Jesus. I'm teaching them how to become a teacher.
Okay.
I'm teaching them how to become a disciple maker so that the person I'm teaching will go teach people. And they won't just teach people. They'll teach people how to teach people how to teach people.
So... I think a contrarian point of view would be like, not everyone's built to be a teacher. Would you agree with that? Like, not everyone is called to.
Yeah,
teach
I think that's probably just in the world in general. There's probably some, I just call it like common wisdom or whatever. Some people are capable of doing some things that other people aren't capable of doing. It's interesting to me, when Jesus called his disciples, he did not go out and get like the superstar academics who were going to become he went out and got like fishermen who had probably like flunked out of Jewish school. And he chose common, ordinary people. In fact, in the book of Acts, when Peter, James, and John are getting hauled before the Sanhedrin, it says that they took note of the fact that they were just common, ordinary, uneducated fishermen, but that they had been with Jesus. And I guess what I'm just trying to say is that this disciple making is not some kind of advanced school that's only for the super talented or the academically smart. Everyday, common, ordinary people come into the movement of Jesus and become disciples of Jesus. And it was these common, ordinary, uneducated fishermen that Jesus gathered in Galilee and said, okay, you've been my disciples, go make disciples.
Got it.
And so my viewpoint would be that every disciple is eventually called to become a disciple maker. That all of us are, not by virtue of how smart we are, how capable we are, but by virtue of the fact that we've spent time with Jesus, we then can teach others what it means to be followers of Jesus as well.
Okay.
So I guess that's my basic framework, and I think that that's not the framework of the modern church.
Right.
Like North American church has not had this framework. We've thought to ourselves, the way people are going to learn Christianity is we've got to invite them to church where this pastor who has all this specialized training to teach will do that teaching that the rest of us ordinary people cannot do.
Right.
And I think that centralization is a mistake. We need to decentralize again, which is why I'm saying the first step is we've got to make disciples and teach them to make disciples.
Yeah.
So we got to have a simple rule of thumb around here, which is like, all right, everybody who's a part of our disciple-making movement, find 2 people this year, pour into them. And we've got 2 Timothy 2:2 as our guide. Paul's writing to Timothy. He says, the things you've heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable people who will be qualified to teach others. So we got, Paul to Timothy. Timothy, go find reliable people. Who are these reliable people? They'll be qualified to teach others. So there's at least these 4 generations. Probably Jesus to Paul first as an implicit 5th. But then, those others taught others who taught others who taught others who taught others.
Right.
And I think we've got to recapture that a little bit. So I think, as an example, every church leader should be thinking about who are the 1 or 2 people who are reliable people who I can pour into and train.
You say every church leader? Pastor or like church leader? Like
pastors,
deacon?
church leaders.
Okay. Children's volunteer?
Everybody. So I think eventually what you want is you want this to take root in your church and grow to the place where every single Christian in your church, hopefully that's got to be your goal.
Yeah.
That every single disciple becomes a disciple maker. I think that has to be the goal. And I think that, so I'm going to just talk about my own story. This little church I was telling about that put up that banner, 400 by 2000, 400,000 by the year 2000. And, that little church wound up being one of the, I guess now, statistics of churches that have closed because I can't remember what year, but it was probably while I was in university or shortly thereafter, our church ended up not having the ability and wound up closing its doors. Mm-hmm. So you might say, it lost, the church lost. But there was a pastor in that church who took me aside and started working with me, started teaching me the Bible. And in many ways, everything that's happening here in Florida has at least some relationship to this one pastor in a dying church who took a teenager out to a fast food restaurant across the street from his high school and studied the Bible with him. Now you can just think about this. What was the most effective thing that pastor did? Was it the programs he was running, or was it preaching that he was doing? Probably long term, almost none of that wound up mattering. The only thing that wound up mattering is that he poured into a person who then eventually figured out how to pour into other people, to pour into other people, to pour into other people. And now, at least in our disciple-making movement, we've crested over 1,500 people in the last 5 years. Well, it all goes back to this One
chain,
pastor,
goes right
one
up to-
pastor who was pastoring a dying church, and he got burnt by ministry. He was only less than a year in our church, and ended up getting burnt by ministry. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is, I think the long-term sustained effort that we have to start putting into is not like, oh, we better get better programs, or we better whatever we think the solution is. There's no magic bullet like, oh, if we change the way our churches look, or we updated the carpet, or actually the most profound thing we can do is pour into someone's life, really teach them about Jesus and the gospel, but then teach them in such a way that they'll be able to teach others, who will teach others, who will teach others, and let this disciple multiplication start to take root.
You said 2 a year. Same time, one-on-one?
Well, for me, I really advocate one-on-one.
Any particular
From time to time,
reason?
I've discipled 2 people at the same time in the same place. But, yeah, I think the more narrowly we focus, if we're just working with one people, the deeper we'll go with them.
Okay.
And the bigger the long-term impact will be. So I think, as an example, I preach to a few hundred people on a Sunday morning and put a lot of effort into that sermon, and hopefully people learn things. But if I was to go back and now ask people, okay, 3 weeks ago I preached about this, what do you know about it?
Forget it.
I don't even know what I preached about 3 weeks ago.
Right.
For whatever reason, in that larger group setting, it kind of comes in and goes out,
Right.
which doesn't mean it's not important. Food comes in and goes out. We have to keep eating it.
Right.
But I think, as far as teaching Christianity goes, that larger group setting, it's not like it's completely ineffective, but it's not as effective. So people stumbled on small groups. They realized, if we're learning in groups of 10, it's going to be so much more impactful and going to go so deeper. That's 100% true. That's why for churches it's important to have smaller groups, community groups where people can kind of learn, and you can have more discussion in these groups than you could have, like on a Sunday morning. It's not like you can get into a discussion with people and have back and forth, right? It's more scripted. It's one-way communication almost. In community groups, there's two-way communications. People can ask questions. They can tease things out. But man, there's all kinds of things people won't ask, even in a small group. But when you get one-on-one, now it's just 2 people. Okay, hey, look, I've always wondered about this. I've always been thinking about that. And, now there becomes a forum where you can really go deep with a person and make sure that you get that solid base and help someone really learn what it means to be a Christian, what the gospel is all about, what the message of the Bible is. And anyway, that's why I advocate narrowing down, that you can go deep. That's
just going to take a long time, though. So if someone's if we're looking to turn around a nation, the tide of the trajectory of where Christianity is going in North America, and then in a denomination, and then in a church, I mean, we're talking a time frame here just to set expectations of 10, 20 years.
Yeah, and I like to say this. We have to go slow to go fast. We have to go deep to go wide. And I say that because, man, you mean this year I'm just going to concentrate on 1 or 2 people? What's that going to do? I've got this church, it's all falling apart. I got to concentrate on 200 people.
Yeah.
And you think, this year I got to go fast or else I'm doomed. And I guess what I'm trying to say is no. And I'm not telling you to neglect the larger group or your responsibilities if you're a church leader to the larger group. What I am saying is prioritize going slow and going deep with just a person or 2. And then, if you choose 2 people this year, hopefully by next year, you and your 2 people can go find 2 more people. So you start with 3. In year 2, you have 9. In year 3, you have 27. In year 4, you have 81. In year 5, you have 273. And now that kind of multiplication starts to kick in. Mm-hmm. And, you went slow at first, but now because of that, you're going way faster than you could have ever gone because you have a solid group of people around you who are committed to not only being disciples of Jesus, but being disciple makers and disciple multipliers. And it's not just one person who, okay, I've got this neighbor or friend who needs to know Jesus, I better bring them to this one person who's qualified to teach. No. Hopefully, because you're part of this church, you're qualified to teach. Yeah. And not only are you qualified, like if they try bringing them to the one person, you're like, hey, why are you bringing them to me? You know.
Yeah.
You should do this.
Right.
And that's why I just think it's been overlooked. If I think about kind of our legacy system that we have, our legacy operating system for the church, I think we've got to get back to what I call a disciple standard, which is where the average ordinary person who might be uneducated or unschooled or whatever, they've spent time with Jesus. And for that reason, they're capable of things that the world can't even understand. So that's the first thing I would say is, as church as a whole, it at least appears to me that if we've got this vicious cycle going against us, fewer churches, fewer leaders, fewer disciples, fewer churches, fewer leaders, fewer disciples, we start at the kind of base unit level of
disciple.
Making a disciple.
Mm-hmm.
As we start making and multiplying disciples, I think what winds up happening, I've seen this with my own eyes here in our context, that what ends up happening is people start making disciples and they think, oh, the Spirit's with me and I think I have a gift for this. And I think actually I want to commit myself to becoming a leader of God's people and I want to get more education anyway. So I think what happens next is leader multiplication.
They start developing.
You multiply disciples, and then what will happen is the natural outflow of that is there'll have to be leadership development. And then eventually, as you multiply leaders, you're going to be able to multiply ministries and multiply churches. And I think that completes the cycle of a virtuous cycle, multiplying disciples, multiplying leaders, multiplying churches. These churches are going to multiply disciples, so we're going to have more disciples. Then we're going to get more leaders, and none of these leaders are going to start and strengthen more churches, and all these churches are going to be committed to disciple multiplication, and so now you start to get a little bit of a virtuous cycle. And my suggestion is that because this tide's going out, it's not like, oh, there's a snap of the fingers, there's a magic bullet, we're going to fix this. Instead, there has to be a sustained collective effort of people who they can see how just getting committed to the basics of the gospel and the Great Commission, and really starting at kind of like the basic unit level of, okay, I'm a church leader, I'm going to make 2 disciples this year. Mm-hmm. I'm going to look for really reliable people. I'm going to go out and I'm going to find them. I'm going to spend time with them intentionally, helping build them up in the faith so that they can join me in this mission and they can go find 2 people next year. I think that simple commitment really can, over the course of time, start to have a big impact.
So if I'm listening, how do I start? What would I do? Like, do I go and find a disciple? Is there any action steps, practical steps that you could lead me towards? Like, what should I do? How do I start?
Well, I guess one of the things that I've just taken note of is, as I've talked this over with people, most Christians today themselves have never been in a process where someone mentored or discipled them. And then if you say, okay, go do this, they haven't experienced it themselves. There's nobody who's done it for them. And so it's difficult to figure out, how would I go do that? So I think most of us are in need of a model. And that's what our ministry 222 Disciple is all about. So if there are people who are listening in, the very first thing I would say is just be discipled through this process. You might be a very mature Christian and you might not learn anything about, Christianity. You might, but you might not. But what you will learn is how to go out and find someone and what process you might use to disciple them in such a way that they'll be able to go disciple others. So I would invite people, if they're listening in and they like what they're hearing or they want to know more about it, that would be the first step, is to just you can go to 222disciple.com, and you can, we have a series of videos that you can watch that sort of explains the process, and then you can log in, and we'll find a mentor for you who will teach you so that you can begin to start teaching other people and implementing this. And so if you're intrigued, that would, to me, be the best first step.
Okay. When we could go to 222disciple.com for that. Links are all in the description down below. There's also a bunch of testimonials on the website that, from pastors to moms, stay-at-home moms, to single parents, to grandparents.
Yeah.
There's a whole bunch of people within our congregation and outside the congregation. Like you said, over 1,500. We just crested over it on multiple different continents and countries and different languages. So there's a whole bunch. There's like Hausa and Portuguese on there. So there's a lot of stuff on there. If you guys are interested, if anyone's listening, please visit the links down below. Any last final thoughts and parting thoughts on kind of this whole vicious and virtuous cycle?
I guess just something about our culture and where things are at right now. So I mentioned the rise of the internet, the rise of social media. It's interesting because like on Facebook, you can have literally thousands of friends. But I think one of the ironies, I don't know if it is an irony, you can have 1,000 friends on Facebook, but be very lonely.
Yeah.
I think actually our world is isolating now, and people are dying for relationships and for friendships. And it's interesting to me that at one point Jesus said to his disciples, I no longer call you servants, but I call you friends. And what's going to happen as you disciple people, actually, you're offering something that people are dying for, which is genuine friendship in Christ.
That's good.
Our culture right now, people are just dying for friendship. And I think that's one of the natural things that results if you start an intentional relationship that's about becoming a disciple of Jesus, is you're going to develop tremendous, tremendous friends. And one of the things I love about Sunlight is there is a network of just tremendous friends and real friendship. And so I guess what I would say is, to me, starting at this level of making disciples also meets where our culture is at right now, where people have they have a lot of quote-unquote contacts or friends on Facebook, but no real friendships and relationships.
Yeah, they're called followers, actually. Like we're all looking for followers.
Just follow each other or whatever. And, especially now with the light of with Google, or now especially with AI, you have access to all the information in the entire world.
Right.
And you can have all that information, but what do you do with it? It's not curated. Yeah. And what we need is the wisdom of what happens in a mentoring relationship. Of, hey, this is what I'm going through. What do you think? We need advisors. We need mentors. We need friendships to help us navigate all the information there is in the world, right, and see our way through it to what's true and what's real and what's valuable. And I think with everything, all information sort of comes at us so cheap that we don't know the truths that are really valuable.
Right.
And I think that's also where starting at the level of disciple making will make, maybe it's going to seem like nothing at first. It's just you and a couple other people, and you've got all these big problems and the current's sweeping us out to sea. But I think it's just, maybe the discipleship as an act of resistance. Like everything's being swept out, but I'm planting my feet on the ground and I'm trying to push back and get the water to start heading the other way. I think it's like a countercultural thing we can do that in the long run, as we start to gain some traction, again, it's not a magic bullet. It's no overnight success. We're going slow to go fast. We're going deep to go wide. But I think the more and more people who will join in and plant their feet in the ground, the more we're like resisting the current, pretty soon we're going to start to make some progress forward together.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining this podcast, and thanks for watching and listening. And we're going to ask you to join the movement of discipleship at 222disciple.com is a great place to start. Thanks for watching. We'll see you guys next week.
All right. Bye.
The future is now.